If you were able to worship online last week, then you may remember that we began a new sermon series that we are calling The Heart of Worship. The Heart of Worship. We want to become a vibrant, life-filled community that helps to seek to make Christ known. And so we're beginning this discussion, a conversation about this thing that we call worship. Last week, Phil kicked things off, the conversation about how worship can be vertical. If you were watching online, there may have been some things that stuck with you, some notes that you wrote. When I was sitting in my living room, I had actually pulled out my laptop and took some notes. Here are some things that I wrote down. I wrote down that we were made for worship. It's actually what we were made for worship. I wrote down that worship is a response of loving surrender to who God is and all that he has done. Phil said that over and over and over again. I wrote that down. I also wrote down who we worship defines how we worship. Who we worship defines how we worship. It speaks to that vertical nature of our worship. And I've reflected on those points this past week, really taking an inventory of my life to see, Ryan, does your life, does it reflect those? And at times that it does, and there are a lot of times that it doesn't. And apparently all it takes is 2 days of no power at my house for the not ideal version of Ryan to come out. I mean, when the power came back on, put everything back together, at some point my wife turned to me and said, Ryan, you were not good. And she's right. Man, there's so many times where I just fail to live up to the idea that my God is worth worshiping and I give him my first and my best. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to reflect on that this past week as well. This morning, though, we're gonna turn the corner and look not just at worship being vertical, but worship being horizontal or communal. Or to say it differently, what does it look like for God to be most important, not just to me, but what does it look like when he's most important to us collectively? And then what does it mean when we are centered around him? How does that impact the people outside of this room? What does that look like? Hebrews 12:1 invites us to consider him, to consider Jesus. So how does our consideration of Jesus compel us to think about those around us? As we get into it this morning, we can't talk about communal aspect of worship without creating some opportunities during our time together to do that. We just had that a couple minutes ago. But even during my sermon, I'm gonna break it up in a couple different times with some prompts that you can spend some time in groups thinking about some different things that I'll give to you. We wanna practice it some. Now, I'm an introvert. I'm not trying to penalize or punish anyone, okay? But I think we have to practice it a little bit. We have to practice it a little bit. So let's start with the first one. This is not gonna be an overly theological question. Okay, but I'm gonna pose a question. I want you to just get in groups or get around some of the people that are sitting hopefully close to you. Take a minute or two to answer this question, okay? The question is this: have you ever felt like a fish out of water? Have you ever felt like a fish out of water? Find some people around you, talk about that for a couple minutes, and we'll come back. All right, hopefully you've had a chance to share some stories, okay? As I was thinking about times in my life where I've felt like a fish out of water, 2 stories came to my mind immediately. Let me share them with you. The first was, back when I was in college, I said yes to a summer camp, Christian camp experience. And the problem was that in order to be able to do that camp, I had to become lifeguard certified. Now, there are 2 kinds of people in the world. There are swimmers and then there are sinkers, okay? I know how to swim, but I'm much more of a sinker. And I wasn't worried about any of the classes related to being lifeguard certified, but in order to become a lifeguard, apparently you actually have to be able to swim long distances, okay? And so they start with a test, 500 yards. Might as well have been 500 miles in my world, okay? So I was worried about that. That's the first thing they start off with. So I show up at the IU natatorium, about 15 of us or so, and we walk into the natatorium. There are 3 lanes, swimming lanes for us to use, which automatically, I was worried already. because I was expecting to have my own lane off to the side so I can slowly do this. There was no time, and I knew it was going to take me a long time. But no, I had to share the lane with 4 of my best friends. So we go ahead and kick it off. I'm at the end of the line. Okay, I want to go last in my lane, and we start swimming. And it seemed like as soon as I thought about it, there is somebody passing me. Okay, they're passing me to the side. They're coming underneath me. I'm swimming, gasping for air. They're underneath me. You're not supposed to really touch the sides or hang out. I was holding on that for dear life, letting other people go. And even though I was in the water, I very much felt like a fish out of water. Okay, that was one example. Second story, back in 2011, my wife and I were married. We lived in Georgetown, Kentucky, which is right outside Lexington. And we were young, married, no kids. We both are graduates from IU, so we were celebrating. We wanted to participate in one of the basketball games. IU happened to be playing UK that day, if you're familiar with that game. We didn't have cable, so we decided to go to Applebee's with all of our friends. A lot of UK blue there, okay? We were the only people in IU red, and we decided to watch the game. IU, I don't think we were any good. We decided to eat dinner. We paid our bill ahead of time so we can just sneak out, but the game continued. And it was close all the way until the very last possession where IU had a chance to make a shot known as the Watt shot. And the picture is on the screen. That's what it looked like. Okay, and when that shot went up, everybody in the restaurant yelled. Everyone yelled. And then after a couple seconds, only 2 people were yelling. It was my wife and I. And we quickly realized that we were fish out of water. And boy, did we swim out of there really, really quickly. Okay? Sometimes as humans, we feel like fish out of water, where we feel like we're just not in the place that we're supposed to be. Things are, there's just a lot of distance. Things are hard. Okay? It can be true of our relationships. Things seem out of joint. It can be true of our jobs or our careers. It can definitely be true of our relationship with God. It just feels like we're out of place, exhausted. And when it comes to worship, we can feel dry as a bone. We can feel like fish out of water. But here's the thing. Here's the good news this morning, is God doesn't want us to just feel like fish out of water. Not in the everyday lives that we live, and definitely not when it comes to worship. How do I know that? Well, think about a fish. God created an environment for a fish to not only survive, but to flourish. And so if he does that for the fish, wouldn't it be true that he does the same thing for us? An environment where we can not only survive, but an environment in which we can flourish. And it's true, we open up God's word. You open up the story, and right at the beginning, you see the beginning of the story and worship really lived out and defined. It's not a textbook, okay? It doesn't say worship equals this, but you begin to see it on display in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And it becomes clear we aren't necessarily made to do things. We're not human doings, we're human beings. And we see this made clear at the very beginning of the story in Genesis 1. So I would encourage you to open up a Bible. Some of these scriptures are going to be on the screen, but let's go ahead and look at this to see what God has to say about worship starting at the very beginning. Now, if you're turning to Genesis chapter 1, okay, some context for that. This is the beginning of God's story. We're not opening up a science textbook looking for certain answers. Okay, we're really opening up the book to see God, the book that God wrote. God, what are you saying about yourself? He's revealing his nature. He's revealing what he cares about. We see our human beings enter into the story, and so we get to see what our role in place is. And we start in verse 26 is when we see God making it all come together for us. This is what we read. Verse 26, then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, he has a conversation with them. He says, be fruitful, increase in number, fill the earth, subdue it, rule over the fish and the birds in the sky and every living creature that moves on the ground. Then God said, he continues the conversation, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and the birds in the sky and the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. If you were to read all of Genesis 1, that you're going to see God doing a few different things. He's creating order out of chaos. He begins to form the world. Then he begins to fill it. He introduces living creatures, plants on day 3, animals on day 5. And you would notice that when he makes those plants and makes those animals, he doesn't have to do much more than make them and then send them off. You notice that? He makes them, they have everything that they need, and he sends them off. They have everything that they need to be what God intended for them to be. They had everything they needed to, in a sense, live out their calling, live out their duty to worship. But when you look closely at day 6, the section that we just read, you realize that God has something completely different in mind for human beings. Every other animal created and turned loose, but not with humans. Notice that God wanted to have a conversation with us. He made us, and then he brings us close. And he wants to talk to us. Because of all living things, we are created to be with him. We aren't designed to live on our own. We're made for this special atmosphere, a special environment. And that environment is close intimacy and proximity to our Heavenly Father. That's where worship begins. That's what we discussed last week. But it doesn't end there. It doesn't stop there. When we say that we're made for worship, we say a couple things. One, yes, we're made for intimacy with God, but Genesis 1 makes it clear that we're made to live out our identity as image bearers and as those that help make the world flourish. We're to steward and have dominion. That's part of what it looks like to worship. So intimacy with God is vertical, yes, but it should flow out into the horizontal. And stewarding and helping things flourish isn't a one-person gig. Not one person can do it alone. It takes a whole lot of people. It takes all of us. If what I said is true, and I think Genesis bears it out, then vertical worship, it should prompt us. It should compel us to consider other people, to include other people. Or to say it differently, intimacy with God, it should prompt us to be with other people who share and enjoy that intimacy with God as well. And I think that becomes clear when we think about sports teams and the context of fans. Okay? Do you want to watch a team? Do you want to watch a game with players or fans of the other team? Not really. Okay? It's not a whole lot of fun. I'm pretty sure that's why Phil has never invited me to Rupp Arena to watch a UK game with him. Okay? I would just be bad company. Understandably so. Understandably so. But when we decide to watch a game and we're with the people that share our affection and attention to this team, well, then it doesn't matter. As long as we're together, it doesn't matter if we win, doesn't matter if we lose. It's that close shared experience that allows us to be more intimate, allows us to enjoy time together. That's why I think Sunday morning is so important. That's why I think the author of Hebrews makes it very, very clear why it's important not to forsake the gathering. We can read it here in Hebrews. And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, all the more as you see the day approaching. So we're not supposed to forsake the gathering. That's why we're called to leave our sacrifice at the altar if there is a disagreement between one of us, a brother or a sister. There's also just something special about meeting together, gathering on the day of resurrection. That's the reason why we meet on Sunday. This is the day that Christ resurrected. It's unlike any gathering. When we are here together, it's unlike any other gathering that we may have. A class, a group, or being by ourselves out in creation. There is something special that happens in these gatherings. And so that's why we don't want to miss them. That's why we feel the weight of times where we have missed, when we get snowed in, when we get sick, times when we don't prioritize them, we miss out, at least a little bit. We miss out on what we were made for. And this past week, I was thinking a little bit about why is that? Why are there times, it can be true in my life and maybe true in yours, when the worship gathering, a Sunday morning gathering, just isn't something that we prioritize? I think if we're honest, there are times where it's just not the most important thing to us. Okay? And I think that there are reasons for that. I think at times it can be hard, uncomfortable, and difficult to meet together in situations like this. So I want to pause here. We give us another opportunity to chat about this with the people around you. Here's the prompt. Why are the horizontal or the communal aspects of worship difficult at times? Okay, I'm gonna pause, take some time to discuss with your groups. You have a minute or two, and then we'll come back together. All right, let's come back together. Some good conversation there, good discussion. There are probably a lot of different things that we may say that make intimacy with one another in gatherings like this makes it difficult. As I was thinking about that this past week, there are 3 or 4 that came to my mind. We'll see if these are similar to what you may have shared. First thing I would say that just makes intimacy with each other hard would be this: people are messy. Look around at the people around you. Okay, no, don't do that. Don't do that. People are messy. Okay, it's this weird thing of like, if I sit next to them, what am I gonna say? What are they gonna say? How do we end the conversation? It just can be difficult, at least for us introverts, okay? It can be difficult. How awkward was it for me to even introduce the idea of having to look around and identify a group of people that you're gonna spend some time with this morning? It just feels awkward. You're afraid of where the conversation may go, where someone's too honest with you, and now what do you do with that information? What if I see them out getting coffee? It's just hard. It's way simpler to come in, find our pew, find our seat, stare at the stage, and not have to worry about other people, okay? That breaks up, that interferes with the intimacy that we're trying to foster as we gather together. That's one thing. The second thing I would say is people are messy, I'm messy. Okay? I think it's easy to look at the messiness of other people and then not reflect on how we're messy as well. There's a lot of brokenness inside. And I think if we're honest, we see the brokenness inside and we're like, I'm gonna put up some walls here. I don't want people to see my mess. I don't want people to think differently about me. And I would say when I reflect on my own life, and there are things that I may say, but I don't live it out, that when I see that difference, it really interferes with my ability to want to be intimate with other people in gatherings like this. It just hurts it. Okay? It creates distance. And unfortunately, that distance has real repercussions when we don't live out what we say, especially when it comes to this gathering. Brennan Manning famously says this. He says, the greatest single cause of atheism in the world today is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips, but then they walk right out the door and deny him by their lifestyle. Deny him by the lifestyle of, if nothing else, being unified together. That is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. Yeah, there's mess out there and other people. There's also mess in here, and it just makes it hard to want to be together. The third thing I would say is that we pretend. Man, our culture is just a culture of pretend, is it not? Just pretense everywhere you go. Pictures, filters, personas. That's what we're trained to lead with in our culture. And the thing is, worship really should be the exact opposite of that. We can be exactly who we are in front of a God who loves us. And so it just creates this problem. We're communicating to everyone out there, everything's okay. I don't need anything. I'm fine. I have all the answers. Heaven forbid that people have a realistic view of our life. I mean, think about the picture in front of the fireplace that I shared with you earlier. I easily could have shared another picture where everyone is smiling and everyone looks good, right? We're making memories. Well, we were making different kind of memories that day, okay? It's okay to be just who you are, where you are. This gathering is strong enough and big enough to handle that. The last thing I would say is that we're selfish. We're selfish. It's really hard to think about other people first. It's really easy to think about what's important to me, what I like, what I want. And when I consider others, it challenges my self-centered nature. And it forces me to think about something that I often don't want to think about, and that's the idea of sacrifice. That's the idea of sacrifice. And the funny thing is, the definition of worship, or at least the first time that worship is introduced in the Bible explicitly, not in Genesis 1, not in Genesis 2. Where do we find it? Genesis 25. What's happening? Abraham is walking up the mountain with his son, Isaac. We read this in Genesis 22, verse 5. Abraham said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. If worship includes sacrifice, then there should be something that we should be bringing and offering to God every time that we gather. And it also means that we should have an attitude of sacrifice when we consider the people around us. Think about the storm this past week, the multiple ice and snow events that we had, okay? Do a self-inventory. How many different people did I call to make sure that they were okay? And if I heard the answer that they're not okay, that I was ready to move in their direction, whatever that cost. How many other driveways did I shovel? this past week. I'm not being prescriptive here. I'm just saying that it's really easy to say a bunch of things about how worship or how God is important to us or how this gathering is important to us, and our actions may tell a different story. It may tell the story that worship isn't about God, it's actually about us. And that self-worship can be the thing that begins to drive us away from the importance of gatherings like this. These aspects of worship just make things messy. They make things difficult. But the thing is, God doesn't say, hey, just because it's hard, we're not going to do it. That's what we're called to. That's what we're called to be obedient to. Because remember what we read in the New Testament, the different pictures of what this gathering is supposed to look like. We read about that we're supposed to be a building, a temple built together on Jesus. Ephesians talks about us being a bride, adorned for Christ. We also read in 1 Corinthians, what are we supposed to be? A body. Lots of different parts, some external, some internal. Not all seem to have the same meaning or the same significance, but we all find unity in each other. That's where it comes together. Because it's only then that we support each other. We encourage each other. We admonish one another. We hold each other accountable. We live together. See, recognizing who God is and all that he has done should lead us to surrendering our life fully to what we were made for. And what is that? It's a special environment of intimacy where we get to continue the good work that God started, forming the world around us, filling it, stewarding it well with and for the people in this room and the people outside this room. That's what worship is. That's what we were made for. And that's why we choose to gather.